It's another episode of the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Jason.
I'm Kristen.
And I'm Dan.
Awesome. As usual, we are going to start by talking about the games we have been playing recently. And the first thing on the list is Dungeon World. I've been running Dungeon World on our new Gauntlet Hangouts community on Saturday mornings in this event called Saturday Morning Cartoons. I don't have much more to say about it, mostly because we've talked about Dungeon World a bunch, except to say that it's going very well. It's fun to game with people from across the varied lands. And we're doing Spelljammer now, so that's pretty cool. If you're into the old Spelljammer setting, I am. So it's pretty badass. The next thing on the list is In a Wicked Age, and that was you and I, Kristen. Kristen, do you want to set In a Wicked Age up?
Sure. The basic concept is that you don't create characters at the very beginning. You allow the scenario that you're playing to create the characters for you. So you have a list of
the oracle,
the oracle things that are present in the story you're trying to tell. You draw cards to determine what those are. So, for example, if you drew the Ace of Spades, it would be a certain thing. And then from these various people or interactions that are taking place in your scenario, you create a list of characters. So, for example, in our game, we had a treasure seeker and the slave spirit who whispers to them. So, obviously, you could have a treasure seeker character and you could have a slave spirit character. And I think we even thought maybe we might have a treasure character, someone or something that's the treasure.
Character. Yeah.
And then each of these characters can be claimed by players at the table, and anybody or anything left goes to the DM to play. And it's one of the die allotment systems where you have a D4, 2D6s, a D8, a D10, and a D12, and you place them on various abilities or focus.
They're called forms. Forms.
Okay. And use those as a way of resolving conflicts. What's interesting about In a Wicked Age is it's entirely PvP. It's all created about conflict between the characters rather than them working together in any fashion, and that conflict drives the storyline and produces an outcome. And in the series, only certain characters will make it back for the next game, which could be somewhere in the future or somewhere in the past from the previous one. So I think that's basics.
Yeah, that's a good summary. It's a Vincent Baker game, we should mention. I like In a Wicked Age a lot for all the reasons you mentioned. One of the things that it does, we've talked about it in the past, but one of the things that it does that is quite interesting is during the conflict resolution, you are engaging in this process that is, it's a negotiation essentially. Like when you're rolling dice against each other, all you're doing, you're just rolling dice to give yourself an advantage in the ongoing negotiation about how the story should go. So it's like a conflict taking place like between the players, right? And you're kind of advocating for your character's best interests. In fact, the characters each have a thing called a best interest, right? They have two of them. And so I kind of like that. It's a little rough when you're playing it for the first time with new people, but after that first chapter, that first session, it goes, from experience, we know it goes really well after that first one. And this, we started a brand new series. It was as anticipated as I knew it would be. It was a little rough. I make a point of very explicitly teaching the conflict resolution via example before we even start any part of it. And
it's different than anything you really see in the other systems.
Even with that, it's still quite different because you have to have this real hard separation. Once dice hit the table, you have to really separate yourself from your character. You are very much negotiating for your character as if you were a lawyer. What you're trying to avoid is is the dice roll like an outright win on the dice from someone, which allows them to penalize your character heavily, right? Mechanically, even if they're not getting what they want in the fiction, they get to lower a couple of your forms, and that's very penalizing because it's basically permanent, right? And so the analogy there is I thought of this analogy just today. In fact, the analogy is when you are facing off in a lawsuit against someone, right? There's a lot at stake. And in fact, you're probably both going to be, no one's going to come out of it great at the end if you go all the way to trial, right? Because you're going to spend so much money on lawyers' fees and all that kind of stuff. And so you want to negotiate out. You want to settle, right?
Right.
That's kind of what In a Wicked Age is doing. The dice are prompting you. They should prompt you, if you're doing it correctly, to want to negotiate to a good story outcome. And when it works great. But that first session is always a little rough. So what were your thoughts on that first session?
I think it's interesting in having this is my third time playing in A Wicked Age, and one of the things that I've definitely
not third session, your third
my third
series, right?
Yes, third series of playing. Yes, one of the things that I've learned over time is I'm a very competitive person, and so starting off in the game, you have two best interests, and man, that was my goal. Was I am going to achieve both of my best interests. I am going to win these die rolls because that is winning. I will win this.
Right. Yeah.
And that's not the point. And in fact, most of the time, I find that my characters tend to be characters that don't come around for the second and third installments within a series. I tend to play ones that are there once, and I don't.
They burn hot for one session.
Yeah. Because I'd rather sort of use up their storyline in one big go than draw it out and have this like multi-arc thing going on. But I really like it. It was fun. We had a person at our table this week past week who not only was new to In a Wicked Age, but is new to role-playing games.
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And so it was interesting watching him sort of walk through and figure things out. It was really hard for him.
In A Wicked Age.
Yeah. It was really hard for him to separate the negotiation stage because he kept wanting to role play it.
Right.
And it's unusual to just say, okay, we've rolled dice. You are now no longer your character.
Right. We are strictly
Kristen. I am Kristen again. Yep. I'm no longer, Akita and let's talk brass tacks here.
Right.
But I really liked it.
Just to clarify for listeners who may not be familiar with it, when you mentioned like your character coming back or not coming back, or burning hot for one session and not being able to come back, the sort of the goal of the game I think Vincent had in mind for the game is it's a sword and sorcery setting, right? And the idea is you play it over the course of multiple sessions, but like, so session 1 might take place in year X, right? And session 2 might take place in year X plus 100, right? And any characters who are returning are like ghosts or whatever, right? Or spirits or gods or whatever. Or it might be year X minus, 20, and we're seeing a character as a child, right? It's the idea is you're jumping back and forth between these important moments in history, seeing these characters. And usually what happens, we've played several series of it, over the course of the last few years. And usually what happens is there's one character who is like the constant thread, like between all of them. But you're right. That character is not always the character who is, for lack of a better phrase, I'll just say it again, like burning really hot, like on that session, like, because the only way you get to come back is or one of the main ways you get to come back is if your name ends up on this list called the We Owe list. And in order to get on the We Owe list, you must go up against people who are stronger than you at things. And so if you're playing your character super aggressively, like attacking people at their weaknesses, they're going to be successful in that session, but they're not necessarily coming back.
Right.
So, it's an interesting thing.
I think it's really also kind of interesting how quickly it becomes apparent which character it's going to be.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's happened every time I've played as well.
It really has. Yeah.
And it would be a character which when you're first making your list of characters to choose from and people are choosing, you wouldn't necessarily think that would be the one, but within a good 30 to 45 minutes, it becomes clear that they're sort of this linchpin around which everything is revolving, and they develop these longer storylines that are really nice, really rewarding.
Yeah. The last time we or maybe the time before the series before the last series we did of this, we had one character that basically we saw essentially going back and forth in time. What we saw essentially like a Darth Vader kind of story, right? Like we saw them being like young and idealistic, and then we saw them later as like, a mad tyrant, like consumed by power. Like, and we got to see the whole spectrum of his like changes, but like kind of jumping around in time. It's a really, really neat game in that regard. Yeah. It does a lot of really cool, innovative things. You played it, right, Dan?
I played in that first rough session and had never played it since.
Yeah, you only got the rough session. Yeah, the first session is always
better.
The first session is always very rough. It's almost unavoidably so, unless you're just playing with people who have just played it a bunch, right? Well, the next game on the list is. I can't read that. How do we storm?
How we are like the storm.
How we are like the storm. Tell me about how
are we like the storm?
How are we like the storm, Dan?
That is an interesting question. How We're Like the Storm is a game by Jackson Tegu. I think it came out of his Patreon. It's like $5 or something. It's a 2-player game, and he says you should play it with someone who you would either have positive or neutral feelings about holding hands with for an extended period of time and possibly embracing.
Oh.
And that's pretty accurate. So I played with my wife, and The way that it works, the setup for this game is go to the store and buy paint that you can paint on each other with, because over the course of the game, you're going to be painting on each other's arms down from like essentially the elbow down to the palm. Mm-hmm. And then at some point you kind of run out of space on their hand and start writing on your hand as well. And so the end result is this kind of cool little map of pictures that kind of flow down one person's arm, and then the other person's arm has another painting going down it, and then they sort of meet in the middle. I mean, it looks terrible, probably, in all likelihood, because you're probably not going to be painting masterpieces, but it's a lot of fun. The way it works is there's a little bit of character generation stuff in the beginning. You set up like who your characters are, and the premise is that it's been 10 years since you've seen each other, and now you're traveling back to a location to meet again. And you decide kind of what the terrain is like and like who you are and why you're coming back after all this time. There's a few little examples that you pick from. It's very spelled out actually, but you end up with interesting characters. So our characters had been involved in a secret and careful dalliance in their youth before our families had to flee because of political instability. Okay. That was a prompt from the game itself. That was one of 3 things we could choose. And then you sort of decide who each of your characters are and why they're coming back. So we were coming back for like the 10-year anniversary of this horrible massacre type event that was the reason we left in the first place. And so as you're going, you talk about what you see on your trip and like how you start out. And whoever's not talking is taking the paint and drawing on your arm a representation of what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Could you give us an example of like what that might be?
Sure. So like I wake up in the morning and leave my house and see the mountains stretching out in front of me. Something like that. And it's as short as that.
Okay. And so then you might paint some mountains.
Right. Maybe they would paint mountains or something. But then once they're done painting what you said, they paint something else without telling you anything about it. And your job is to look at what they've painted when they're done and interpret it and fold that into your narration. Ooh. So, maybe they paint a sad face and you're like, and I was sad, and you make up the reason why, right? And so then it switches and the other person narrates while the first person draws on them, and then the first person draws something else and they roll it back in their narration. And that happens until the paintings meet each other on your hands. And then that's when your characters have met again. And then there's a little like LARPy sort of thing that happens, and you sort of decide how they meet each other again and what their reaction to each other is. But the most interesting thing about all of it is that there's a lot of restrictions on talking, and because you can't ever explain what you're drawing or anything like that. But while the person is painting on you, the only thing you can say is you can muse aloud about your relationship, about your character's relationship to theirs, and how it is like a storm. So,
there we go.
You can only talk about it in the context of comparing it to a storm.
That's very interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And so, I don't know, like, it played out kind of interestingly in our game because my wife was going into very emotional, like, comparisons and talking about how,
like the storm is a metaphor.
Right. Yeah. And so, well, I mean, the storm is always a metaphor.
It's
right.
Well, sure.
It shouldn't be like, we're like the storm and that we're both all wet. Like,
we're both made of rain clouds.
Yes. Yeah. We are both 78% water. That is how we are like the
storm. Got it. Oh, sorry, continue.
Right.
Yeah.
But so she was going into like these emotional things about how we felt about each other and all of this. And I was going into like the sort of history of our characters and the effect that our relationship had on the community itself.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And so it turned out that like at the end, we sort of discovered that our relationship was what sparked the massacre that we were going back to commemorate. And I don't know, it was just really interesting because you start to kind of like get a feel for where you're going with your similes and all of that. And you go to places where you wouldn't expect. Like there's a surprising amount of range in how a relationship can be like a storm, it turns out.
I love this. This sounds awesome. Like, audience, you or listeners, you can't tell this, but everybody is smiling in listening to you talk about this.
It does, yeah, it sounds really cool. I'm smiling for a slightly different reason. It does, no, the game does sound really cool, but I'm reminded, I've always thought that like the very best story games go right up to the line of seeming like a parody of story games, you know?
Yeah,
and this is definitely one of those, right?
It really is.
Yeah, it really is. So, but I love it. I think it's great.
I was just thinking as you were talking about this that, you know, we've done episodes of the podcast where it's, you know, how to get your parents to play games with you or whatever. And this sounds like an excellent nominee for how to get a spouse or significant other who's not really a gamer to play games with you, because this one sounds like it could be funny or sad or kind of sexy, or, you know, you could really spin it different ways. It sounds awesome.
Well, I like how you and April are doing the whole like all of the romantic 2-player games,
right?
Yeah, you're getting all those under your
and
your
also
belt.
murderous ghosts,
And that too, yeah.
Balance. Marriage is about balance.
Though I will say, like, one of April's thoughts about this game was that she was kind of unsure about what she was supposed to be doing in a lot of it, because it's very open-ended. There aren't like really any way. There's not much guidance about what you're supposed to be doing and what you're supposed to be saying, and like there's not a plot per se.
Yeah,
That's
it's all
sometimes.
description and feelings, and like you're describing what you're walking through and how you feel about that. So
imagine how we felt taking a guy who'd never played a role-playing game and said, "Let's start with In a Wicked Age."
yeah.
Which is nothing like most of the games we play.
Yes, yeah. No, I empathize. Okay, cool. So the next game on the list is Zombie Cinema. I played that yesterday, in fact. Instead of playing Undying, we've had Undying on the calendar for like 3 weeks, and for whatever reason, the forces that be have just prevented that from happening. So we've been doing different things.
Yeah, I guess I should technically have Dead of Winter on my list as well. Because that's what we did last time.
Yeah, because you
instead
played
of playing Undying.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So we did Zombie Cinema, and man, I love Zombie Cinema. So Zombie Cinema is a story game. The goal of the game is to create a zombie movie, you create a story that has the narrative beats of a zombie film, right? It accomplishes this with like this little board that is tracking 2 different things. It's tracking the zombies' progression, like their narrative progression. So like they start at, you know, whenever zombies are on screen, they're not really on screen. We just hear about them like indirectly, like rumors or whatever, right? But then they move up on the board, and now we see zombies like 1 or 2 at a time, right? And then it moves up to they're in strong groups, and then, you know, all the way up to like, you know, they've overrun your fort or whatever, right?
Right.
So,
is there any explicit instruction about how the zombies should work? Are they slow zombies? Or are they fast zombies? Or
no,
does
they're
it
not.
matter?
No,
Okay.
I think I think you're supposed to stick to the normal, like, you know, classic zombies, because one of the steps that can happen later on in the zombie progression, which I can't imagine how you'd even, well, we got to it, actually, I say that, but one of the later steps is the zombies get like abilities and powers that they didn't have before.
Okay.
So like that's when you can make them fast or whatever,
Gotcha.
right?
Fast zombies are cheaters.
Yeah.
Yeah, they kind of are. And I guess if you're not super worried when there's just 1 or 2, they must not be that fast, right?
So we played that out. We were doing a setting that was like medieval Europe. And so there was all kinds of like implications of like witchcraft and stuff like that, right? So we were doing like this like Middle Ages thing, and all of our characters were like towards the end were like holed up in a cellar, and the zombies progressed to being able to have like previously unknown abilities. So they heard the zombies like in the house, like, you know, like roaming around trying to get into the cellar, but then it just went silent. Like it went totally quiet, and they're like, "Oh, maybe they wandered off." But it wasn't. They were just being quiet to lure them out. So, so that was their brand new ability. They had enough sentience to like just get quiet. and then we saw like Elsa the maid go up the stairs and get ripped apart. So
The visual of a whole bunch of zombies just holding very still.
Right. Yeah. I like the idea that they all hit on it at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so it's tracking these 2 different things. It's tracking like the narrative beats of a zombie film, like, you know, in terms of like how we see the zombies appear on screen. And then it's also tracking like whether your characters are going to be eaten. Like, are they in the story, are they like sort of significant enough to escape, you know, to be in the finale or not, or be eaten by the zombies? And so it's tracking these 2 different things there. You know, you do it with pawns on this little board, but it's not like geographical or positional tracking. It's like story arc tracking. And it's pretty cool. It works great. It has a setup process that allows you to create characters in almost any setting. You use these like cards. You draw these cards that kind of give you some sort of general ideas of what your character is all about. But you can transport that into like any kind of setting. I think the classic setting is like 1960s, you know, zombie movie, right? But we did a Middle Ages thing that had, you know, like, as in all good zombie films, the real monster is man, right?
Right.
Like, yeah, but you can kind of like create any setting you want. It works pretty well. It's great. It's a good game. I mean, it's solid. It plays in about 2 hours. It's just real damn solid. I can't find anything to not like about it. So really, really good time. So Zombie Cinema. The next game on the list is, and the final game, Night Witches. Jason Morningstar's Night Witches, which all three of us were in. Which of you, I just talked a bunch. Which of you wants to set that up?
I'll do it.
All right, go for it, Dan.
So Night Witches is about female fighter pilots or bomber pilots during World War II. They're Russian, actually, as an all-female Russian bomber wing division.
To be fair,
Soviet,
but yeah.
This is a real thing during World War II, and they were set up basically doing like harassment missions of the German line, and everything they did was incredibly dangerous, and basically everyone wanted them to fail for one reason or another, you know?
Right, yeah.
Like, just because of inherent sexism at the time, like a lot of they got very little support from even their own army, and were expected to do much more than the male soldiers with a lot less in terms of support and supplies. Just super dangerous stuff. I've been prepping to run it and kind of reading through the book, and he goes into a lot of detail about the actual historical missions that they flew and all of that. And it is mind-blowingly crazy.
It really is. Yeah.
It really makes you like respect these women as actual people, like just the shit they went through. So, but anyway, it's a Apocalypse World hack based on that. And it's kind of got like this 2-phase structure where during the day, you're dealing with like the realities of just existing at the front line of a war and having a real shitty command structure and real shitty support. And you're kind of constantly having to find supplies and fix your own airplanes and all of that with very limited resources available to you. And also hopefully sleep enough so that when night comes, you're basically on every night and you're flying these missions in the pitch black to try and bomb German targets with like bombs or railroad ties, they said,
or
and all
whatever
this,
they
had, like whatever you can throw out of the airplane on these Germans. Bearing in mind that it was considered like too much weight to bring along things like parachutes, like non-essential things like that.
I mean, these are like shitty planes.
And they're terrible planes. Yeah. So, but like every mission is super dangerous, and that really comes across in the game itself.
It really does.
And like, even if you're rolling perfectly, things still go wrong all the time. Like things are slightly less terrible if you're having really good luck with the dice, but they're still kind of terrible. And so
there's no complete success in this game, which is so strange.
Not at nighttime, no.
Yeah, not at night. Even if everything, if as you said, you roll a 10 or higher, you're still going to have something bad happen.
Yeah. And so then that means, of course, during the daytime or when you get back, you have to explain why things went wrong and all of this. So even on a perfect run, you still get berated when you get back to base about how things didn't go like they were supposed to, right?
Yeah, it's great. I think the one thing that stands out to me is that I really love about it is that the grind of the day and night cycle. I think is something that he really wanted to capture, and he does a really great job of it. Like it's like, okay, we're doing all this stuff in the day, and now we're doing the thing in the night, and then we're going to do all this stuff in the day, you know, and it's like nonstop. And it's so, it's such a grind and not monotonous. That's not the right word, but like, it's so,
well, it feels like you never have enough time to do everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like it's so relentless. I think it's so relentless that stuff just starts to compound on these women, right? They might ultimately fail just because they're so exhausted, right? You know, it's great. What'd you think, Kristen?
I'm in love with it. I love especially the addition of the cards, the photo cards.
Yeah.
And it's just a small touch, but I think that most of them are portraits of backers, because that was one of
so too, yeah.
One of the perks you could get if you funded a certain level was that you got your portrait included in the style of a Soviet air pilot. But it's great. It's great seeing these faces, because you get to choose them for yourselves, and looking across the table to say Dan's pilot, and it's got, she's got her little name tent of what her name is, but then there's a little picture propped up against it.
Right. Yeah.
It's a great personal touch. It's really nice. I very much like the system. It's not at all about advancing, because though you can advance, there's no real at this point, there's no real strategic reason for this. They're small bonuses, but you don't bump your stats like you do in Dungeon World, unless you take this one particular kind of advancement. It's not a routine thing that every advancement you take, you bump your stats.
Your character's getting better, like, quote unquote better, or whatever.
And so it's you're really squishy. It's really easy to die, but the advancements that you can make or the marks that you can take are all they're individualized for the character sheets, which is nice. We don't all have the same choices.
On the marks.
On the marks.
On the marks.
So you're kind of bleeding into talking about the marks.
Yeah. Well, and the advancements aren't as well. Yeah. My advancements were different than somebody else's.
Oh, okay. Too. I haven't actually looked at the sheets, so. No.
I don't know. They're nice details. They're thoughtful.
Yeah, we should go ahead and talk about the mark thing. I mean,
sure, let's do it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the mark system it's similar to advancement, except it's kind of like
it's not even though. It's like
it's not though. It's like a penalty.
It's like a sideline,
or not a penalty. No, it's not a penalty either.
I mean, it's just something that happens a lot of times just in the fiction, and so you're kind of like moving through these fictionally important milestones for your character.
It's character development,
right? Yeah. It's cool. It's the only PBTA game I know that has a system like it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we should probably specify kind of what it is so for people who've never looked at the game. It's basically a list of things. Some of the moves that you'll do, like one of the options you'll have to take is, like if you get like a 7 to 9 or whatever, one of the options might be, take a mark, or
it's a consequence for rolling poorly, or just a consequence for, I rolled a 10, but I still have to take a consequence.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Like in Night Witches, where there's always a consequence, right? So for PCs, the marks they're these list of things that all like kind of like develop the character, right? But for NPCs, the marks are usually marked for death. Like it means that the NPC is going to die. Now, if you mark off enough of them on the PC sheet, one of the last ones that you can do, I guess if you've done all the rest, is you're dead, right?
Well, you can take them in any order.
That's true. You
could
choose
die on the first mark you take if you wanted to, but.
And we've talked about the narrative utility of that in previous episodes. I mean, like this idea of like being able to control when your character dies is a very important, like it's a very interesting mechanical conceit that not enough games do, and frankly, a lot of role players don't even know why that's cool. I mean, it's Dan has went on at length in the past about. Like not on the podcast, but just in private, like about how
also on the podcast. I think
on the podcast too. Yeah, but one of Dan's big things is like, why should our character's death be like this thing that's controlled? Like, why is it's this arbitrary thing controlled by dice, right? Yeah. That's not how it would happen if you were writing a movie, right? You wouldn't roll dice in the middle of your script and say, oh, that character's dead. Like, you would want them to die at an appropriate point in the story, right? And in fact, your character did, not as a result of the marks, but like you chose to basically kind of say, you know what, I think this is it for my character, right? Like,
save the others.
Yeah. So anyway, the marks, like one of them is death, but some of them are like, tell a story. If you take this mark, it's like, tell a story about back home, so you have to do that. Or,
one of them is make a new friend.
Yep.
Yeah. They're cool. The advancements, which is a different thing, that's just like your standard Apocalypse World advancement stuff. Pick a move, do this or do that. I haven't actually looked at them. What other things are on there?
Well, so you can either, increase in rank, which also bumps your stats. You can get a medal, which bumps a completely different stat.
A stat called medals.
Yeah.
Right.
You can add a move, so you can't like increase your stats and get a new move,
right? Because
adding a move is a separate advancement. Or you can move on to the next duty station, which advances the entire story.
Okay, I see. And each of those, within each of those, is a certain number of times you can take them, right?
Yes.
Cool. Yeah. Night Witches, it's really awesome from the GM's perspective, which is the only way I've experienced the game so far. Because we ran it as a one shot, maybe 4 or 5 months ago.
Yeah.
But now we're doing like we're doing multiple sessions, working through the duty stations. One of the things I think is really interesting about it is you don't really have to prep anything as a GM, because all of the material that Jason has put together for this game is pretty complete. I mean, each duty station has all the missions that you're going to go on. It has like, some questions about things that questions you can kind of ask the players to kind of get the story kind of rolling. It's got, the MC sheet has like 4 or 5 like ready to go threats, like they're ready to go and you can just use those all the time. You don't have to like make new ones. And what's cool about it is like for those threats, they're all things that are thematically important to the game. So you really can't like the mechanics are like basically forcing you to tell this certain type of story. They're forcing you to be true to what the story historically was. And I like that about it.
Yeah.
It's really good. Like you can't go too far afield as a GM. Like you are,
right.
You know, it's pretty awesome. It's got this one little thing which I'm not into. I don't think you have to do this. This is an optional thing, and we chose to do it, and I kind of wish we hadn't. But for the first session, as an option, you can do this. It's kind of like a scripted first session where the characters like go through basic training or their little training thing, and they talk to certain people at the training station. I wasn't really comfortable with it personally, just because I'm not that kind of GM. Like I had a hard time like adapting that to my GMing style. Like I just like to kind of like have a big picture of what needs to happen and then just kind of work with you guys and make it more like a conversation. This scripted thing felt just a little forced to me. I mean, I gather that some of the people liked it because it's educational.
Well, so I thought it was like, I was a little less harsh on it than you, because I thought that it does a really good job. Like the descriptions are very good, and the things that it's making you do are a very good introduction to like, well, this is your new life, and this is how shitty everything is, right?
Right.
And it really does a good job of getting that across. Whereas, you know, you probably could have done that just ad-libbing something.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I don't know. It kind of guarantees that like you get this exact experience, and it has a lot of little touches in there that are really good and really clever. So I could have done without having everything that the NPCs said completely scripted.
Right, yeah.
That was the weird part to me.
I think I would like a slightly, I wouldn't mind like the order of things that need to happen in that first session, but it was the like NPC stuff where the NPCs have to say, make sure you say this thing and make sure you say this thing. That's a bit odd to me. But.
I do think that one of the things that took care of was the tone conversation.
Right.
It did.
Because of the script that was provided, you got that slightly humorous but very dangerous. You got that tone and the feeling you're supposed to go for. You got that from their script. And so you don't really have to have the conversation of what it's supposed to be like.
Yeah, you're right. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. That's a good insight. Because one of the things that I do notice that scripted first session does is it kind of puts the wool over your character's eyes a little bit, because you, like it's clearly, you know, like I think they know like that, you know, conceptually how dangerous what they're going to be doing is, but that first scripted session is so like, oh, you meet the cranky sergeant, you know, and then you have to go do this and that. And it's a little bit more like lighthearted in tone. But then, like, you start going on the missions, and, like, that first mission is, like, a daytime, you know, just, you know, dropping bombs on some hay bales, no big deal. The second mission's a little more dangerous because it's at night, and then you get to that final one, that final training mission, which is an actual bombing run over Germans, and people die.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's like this real hard stop, like, oh, like, this is for real, right? This, the little training wheel station is done, and now we're going into the crunch of, like, of the day-night cycle. So yeah, you're right. It does a good job of like introducing a lot of the game's themes and the sort of like impending tone for sure.
One of the other things that I really liked that you commented on feels kind of strange to you as a GM, but that I did like as a player was that there would be these moments when we're transitioning to a new place. I think it's when we're transitioning to a new place, and there's questions for an NPC to ask the players.
Yes.
And they're these sort of meta questions that it's not the character answering, it's you, the player, answering for your character.
But it is the NPC asking.
But it is the NPC asking, which is unusual, and yet I loved the way it sort of checked in and kept you in the story as you're transitioning.
I thought it was weird.
Did you?
I thought it was weird too.
Okay,
yeah,
well,
I thought it was weird.
I really liked it.
It had a sort of surreal quality, I guess, which was kind of cool. But
well, I often find that with games, you'd get this background of your characters at the very beginning, right? When you're like, tell me about your character. And you say what they look like, and everybody's handsome or charming or whatever it is. And then that's kind of it. And then you play the game that you're going to play, and you don't really check in on them as to their background anymore, because it's now about the new things you're doing. Whereas these questions are constantly reminding your characters and you as the player that these people have family back home. These people have loved ones. And, you know, questions like, who are you writing letters to?
Right.
And, you know, what are you missing from home? And it just brings back that poignant, bittersweet feeling of, you know, this might be your character's their last mission. They could die tonight.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it should be pointed out that,
I love it.
It should be pointed out a lot of these questions. This is just really a scripted version of what you should be doing in most Apocalypse World games anyway, right? We don't really do it in Dungeon World so much because I don't I just don't treat Dungeon World like that kind of game, but like we definitely do that in Monster Hearts, right? At least at my table at Monster Hearts, like we have that whole like the Q&A, right? Like it's the nonstop Q&A in that first session. So, he's kind of just like putting down on paper the sorts of things that you should be doing anyway. In that regard, it's a really, really good, like if you don't have a lot of experience with Apocalypse World games, this is a good one to jump in on, honestly. Like from a GM's perspective, like it's got so much helpful information, and like you almost can't mess it up in a way, because there's just, you're not responsible for making fronts and dangers and threats, and you're not responsible. It's all there for you. It's all in this packet, and you just kind of, you ask the questions and go. So, it's pretty good in that regard. Also a very good game for episodic play. That's something that I think doesn't get, mentioned enough about Night Witches on the internet. It's super good for episodic play, and it has to be because the characters die so frequently. So you have to be able to like drop characters in and out as needed. And it seemed to be pretty good for that. So it's got a good system whereby it catches up these brand new characters. So, it's awesome. Cool. Anything else about Night Witches?
Nope.
All right. Awesome. Let's go to the next segment. Our next segment, as always, is Giving Me Life. This is where we discuss things that are not necessarily related to role-playing games that are giving us life this week. I'm going to start. The thing giving me life this week is, I'm calling it the podcast renaissance, kicked off by Serial. So there was that Serial podcast that was hugely popular last year. And there have been a lot of just great podcasts coming out since then. I think podcasts are becoming this thing that like the mainstream of America is more into, which is awesome. And so I've been enjoying listening to brand new podcasts lately, and a couple that I've discovered that I'm going to share with you listeners. The first is called Nocturne, and Nocturne is, this woman who, it's a like a documentary style podcast. But the whole like foundation of the podcast is this woman woke up one night at 2 a.m. and was just wandering around her house, and like wandered around her street, and was taken aback by how different everything felt at 2 a.m. And so this inspired her to like create this podcast where she gets people to come on and talk about like their jobs that are in the middle of the night, or like something they saw once in the middle of the night, and that kind of thing. And so, or like she gets this guy on who like talks about like why having sex at 3 a.m. is so much more like different and intense than any other time, like that kind of thing. So it's this whole show about like nocturnal people and doing nocturnal things. I like it. And the other show is called Lore, Lore. And that one is this author, I can't remember his name, but this author of horror novels. He's got this podcast where he finds, like an urban legend or some kind of like just scary story that we kind of know, like regional stories or like big things like vampires or whatever. And he goes into like the sort of historical background of it. And so he likes to do lots of like location based things. So like, in some place in the Northeast, there's this building that's supposed to be haunted. So he kind of goes into all the, like some of the more like historical background of these stories. Really, really good. Both Nocturne and Lore are very short. And a lot of these new podcasts I'm discovering are very short, like they're only 20 minutes long. So they're kind of like perfectly sized for easy consumption. And so these new podcasts are pretty awesome. I have to say, a lot of podcasts are just young white people discovering things. Like, there really is. Like, it's like a lot of the podcasts are just like, I am a sheltered white person who just discovered this thing. Let me podcast about it. Like that's what most of them are. But within that, there's an interesting story. So.
See, I thought you were going to go into how every podcast just sounds like a blatant ripoff of Serial now, where it's a woman talking in a calm voice over,
over all that.
Interviews, over interviews that are like chopped up, so you don't get the whole interview. And she's like, oh, that was Dr. So-and-so, but we'll get back to him later, over the plonky piano music or like an acoustic guitar. Because there's one that I found recently called Limetown, and it is set up as if it's almost exactly like Serial. The first episode is called What We Know, and it's this mystery about this town where all these people disappeared. Completely fictional, but they never mention that. They're trying to do like awesome. It's like, hey, cereal is cool, but boy, reporting is hard. Let's just make some shit up and make it sound like cereal.
Nice.
Oh. Honestly, Kristen, if you want a new career, kick us off the podcast and just get an acoustic guitar and make up some bullshit mystery, and you will have
my radio voice.
Yeah, you will have thousands and millions of hits and like be immediately sponsored by Stamps.com.
What's funny is I'd never listened to podcasts until the Gauntlet started doing one. Then I was like, I guess I should.
That's true of a lot of people I know.
Yeah.
Like,
And now Scott and I love them, and we have, I think I have 9 I'm following, and he's got even more. So
I love them. I've been a podcast guy for years. I was in a podcast before it was a thing. So
hipster.
I used to burn podcasts onto CDRs so I could listen to them on my commutes and my drives.
Old school. I never did that, but yeah, I love podcasts. All right, cool. So, who wants to go next? Kristen, what's giving you life?
Next. So board games, and specifically, we've gotten, just over the past 3 weeks, Scott and I have gotten 7 new games, 2 of them card games and 5 of them board games. And we're having a ton of fun playing new games and trying new stuff. But 2 of them that have really gone over super well, both from our perspective and with friends that we've played with. One of them is called Sushi Go, which is actually a card game. It's little cartoon sushi that is the cutest sushi you have ever seen in your life. You just want to eat all of them because they're just adorable. They're so cute they make you want to cuss. They're just adorable. It's a set collecting game. So like you need 2 shrimp tempura to score a number of points, and the more sashimi you have, you get these many points. And it's a very fast paced game. So you choose your card, you pass the rest to the next person, and you just pass the cards around the table till you're out of cards, score your points, do another round. It's really fun for just sort of a game between games, or if you're not really wanting to sit down and think seriously about strategy, it's just a fun game to sit around the table with people. So that one's great. Sushi Go. Even if you're not into card games, just go look up the art if you need to smile for the day because it's adorable. And the other is Tokaido. And Tokaido might get the Davis Owen Prize, which is not a prize that exists, but I can make it one. The Davis Owen Prize for Illustrated Game. It is beautiful. Okay. It is absolutely beautiful. So Tokaido is done in a Japanese sort of minimalist watercolor style. And the game is mimicking the road from, I believe, from Kyoto to Edo. And in the time period in which wealthy travelers or poor travelers were trying to go from one major city to the other and have the best experience to talk about once they got to Edo. And so your players move through hot springs and temples and these various places where you perform different tasks to earn points. But it is just visually stunning. It's gorgeous.
Awesome. Yeah.
So there you go.
Awesome. Neat. Board games.
I looked up the cards for Sushi Go and can confirm that they are adorable. So,
all right. Yeah. Confirmed.
Yes. I fact checked it live on air.
This is quality radio we're providing.
Seriously.
Yeah.
Dan, what's giving you life?
I've been doing a lot of traveling, which means I've been reading books, which normally, I don't like to read books or anything. I hear that's frowned upon
super
around
overrated.
These parts.
Yeah, super overrated.
But I've been reading a lot of books because I've been on airplanes.
You can just watch the movie.
It's true.
That's what I say.
The movies are always
I discovered that the book that I'm going to talk about, I think actually has been turned into a TV show in England or something. So
Jesus
I did waste all my time. But it's called The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer. And I mean, it's basically just about the 14th century in England, but it's written from the perspective of like a travel guide. So it's like you show up in 1300 in London, and here's what you see, and here's how you like sort of make a living, and here's what you would be wearing and all of that. And so it goes into a lot of detail about just day-to-day life in the 14th century, things that don't get a lot of focus necessarily in like traditional histories because they're much more concerned about the events that happened and all of that, as opposed to like the day-to-day mundane stuff. But it's actually super interesting. So it's really changed my perspective of all of the D&D games I've ever played now. Because did you know that over the course of the 14th century, men's clothing changed more than any other century?
I did not know that. No.
It went from, in the beginning, it was just like loose fitting robes that kind of draped off of everybody. And men's and women's clothing kind of looked pretty similar because buttons hadn't been invented. But once buttons were invented, things got more form fitting and everything. And like men's clothes got super sexy. It turned into like tight hose and super short tunics. And there's a lot of, he pulls up a lot of writing from people of the times, people he calls old and ugly. Who wrote about these men's fashions, about how their buttocks were hanging out of their tunics and all of this, and just fantastic. Like,
I love it.
And so now every time I think about a D&D game, now I'm just going to be picturing all of the nobles with their asses hanging out of their tunics
and their sexy calves and stockings.
Also, the shoes. They got like longer and longer points on their feet until it was like to the point where it was not like structurally solid anymore. And so they had to have like struts, like guy wires coming off of their belts, holding up the ends of their shoes, and couldn't walk upstairs. They had to like turn sideways to walk upstairs. So now I'm gonna just picture every king with like his ass hanging out, like, walking up the stairs sideways with his giant curled shoes. So yeah, it's great. It's great. I love it.
That's awesome. Cool. Let's go to the next segment. So today we wanted to talk about underrated game mechanics. And here's what I mean when I say underrated game mechanics. Well, I mean exactly what it sounds like, but, okay. So, here's what I mean when I say underrated game mechanics. You know, I think there are certain, like, even within like a particular game, there's like a mechanic that is well regarded by people, but there might be another mechanic within that same game that doesn't get as much credit, right, for how awesome it is. Or in the larger hobby, there are mechanics that, like, you know, get tons and tons of praise, you know, like, the compels and fates or whatever, right? That kind of thing, or the aspects. But there are other mechanics in smaller games, or that, you know, maybe you've never heard of, or they're mechanics that are just doing a really, really cool thing. And, it'd be neat if other games, you know, kind of incorporated something like that into them. So underrated game mechanics is the topic, and we're going to get some help, from the community on this one. And so, I don't know, how should we start, Dan? You want to just start with the three of us, or like
sure,
intersperse ours with community members, or what do you think?
I don't really care.
Okay.
However.
All right. Why don't you start?
Maybe I care. Okay. No, it's fine. I'll go. So, mine is really simple. Mine is from Hot Guys Making Out. And the way that game works is you're kind of going around the table and everyone gets a turn to describe either what their character is doing or what their character's thinking or whatever, depending on who your character is. But you each get a turn to do a thing. And if you can't do a thing, then you describe some aspect of the scene that is not related to your character, right? So you describe the bird chirping in the tree, or the way the sun is setting on the horizon, or something like that. That's not always necessarily appropriate to where the story is. So another option you have is you can have a moment of tense silence that lasts from when you indicate that it starts until you indicate that it's over. And during that time, no one can speak. Everyone is just sitting there and like waiting for this silence to end, which is like, it sounds really ridiculous just kind of describing it. But well, let me come at this from a different angle. So I've been super deep into improv, right? And so I've been reading the TJ and Dave book now about how they do their improv show. Wow. And one of the things that they talk about is that people tend to have this feeling that, like, if they're not talking, that they're not contributing anything. But a lot of times, like, it's okay to just be quiet, and that actually adds to the atmosphere, or like it adds to the story in its own way. And it's something that I think a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate. And like, I think that, you know, there's parallels to what we're doing, right? Like, I certainly have a sense that if I'm not saying anything, or if I'm just like kind of taking my time and thinking about what I'm saying, like I'm holding everything up, right? And so I think that this mechanic that gives you permission to actually like slow the pace of the game down is really cool. And there's kind of parallels a little bit in the like the Nordic dreaming style of RPGs, right? Like Society of Dreamers specifically says, you know, take as long as you want to figure out where you go next. And while someone's thinking, like, everyone else has things they can do that are your own sort of individual, like, mood setting things, but that like silence actually has a role in the game. So yeah, that's it. I like silence, it turns out.
Awesome. Hot Guys Making Out is also a very sexy game.
It's true.
Incidentally. And so that's a great segue to listener Andy's underrated mechanic, because he has a very sexy game as well, Golden Sky Stories. So I'm glad you laughed at least. All right. So listener Andy says his underrated game mechanic from Golden Sky Stories He says, so few people talk about Golden Sky Stories in terms of its mechanics, and more about how it has a particular atmosphere and is geared towards a younger set. There's that joke, listeners. But the thing is, there's some real gems of mechanical brilliance there. One that I really love is that you have two main power stats, feelings and wonder. Feelings are used to boost your attributes so you can succeed at a check. The game is otherwise diceless. Wonder is spent to activate your magical powers, because every character is a cute Japanese animal spirit with magical powers.
I've never heard of this game, so up until now,
really?
So up until now, I had no idea what you're talking about, and then you said cute Japanese animal
It's
spirits,
about
and I was
little.
like, oh,
it's
excitement.
about little magical animals that turn into little kids.
Yes.
Back to disappointment. Okay.
Well,
no, it's really good.
It's really
Actually,
good.
we've played it.
Yeah, it's good. So he says, continuing on, he says, now here's the cool kicker. You get a refresh of feelings and wonder each scene. How many do you get? Well, it's based on the strength of the relationships that you have with others and the relationships others have with you. Relationships are bidirectional. They measure how you feel about one another and how that other person feels about you. If you have strong relationships with others, you get more wonder. If others have strong relationships with you, you get more feelings. So building up relationships with others will increase your power stats, and you can only control some of that. You need others to build relationships with you in order to gain the power stat that lets you succeed at attribute checks. And if if everyone loves you, but you don't build relationships with others, you don't have enough magic juice to fuel your magic powers. He says it's thematic and it's a really cool way to reinforce the main point of the game, which is building community to solve problems. So, I agree. It's a cool game in general.
Yeah.
I love Golden Sky Stories. I didn't like it conceptually at first.
Right.
I really came around to it though. That's probably an underrated game. Never mind underrated game mechanic. That's probably just a totally underrated game.
Well, at least in our corner of the hobby, right? Where
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
just even thematically, it's very different from most of what you would find.
Yeah,
So.
yeah, for sure. No, that's cool. Kristen, what is your underrated game mechanic?
So mine might seem a little silly, especially to people who like more traditional games, but the decorating or customization of your goblins in Goblin Quest, or similarly, designing your robot for Vesna Thaw.
These are things where you actually draw on the paper. Yeah.
And I love it. I love the opportunity to, in Vesna Thaw, it's collaborative, and Goblin Quest, it's on your own, but that there's something on the page that's a different form of being creative, that's fun, and just a little bit childlike and not so serious. I think even though there are other games in which you're drawing, Quiet Year. You draw out the forest, which is great, and
even Night Witches,
and
you
Night
draw
Witches.
the bases.
You draw the bases.
Oh yeah, true.
But a lot of your more traditional pull out your dice, here's where I'm standing, here's what I'm going to do. They haven't embraced the just slightly whimsical side of drawing something, decorate something. What does it look like? And it may seem silly, but I really like it.
That is an underrated game mechanic. Yeah. The act of what's the one? We're like the storm or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
How we're like the storm.
Yeah. We're like that drawing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, hey, it's a thing.
Yeah, and I always feel like I'm more attached to the goblins that I feel like I did a good job drawing.
Absolutely.
So
me
hurts
too.
a little bit more when my cool guy with the cowboy hat and guns gets killed.
I'm the same way.
Because it's a game about easily replaceable creatures, and yet you're sad when they're gone.
Yeah.
Because you really like that scarf that you put on them.
Well, speaking of whimsy,
I love this.
You like my transitions?
I love this. This should be the new thing.
I know. Speaking of whimsy, listener Tim says, quests in Chubo's marvelous wish-granting engine. That's a game that I'm actually not super familiar with. I didn't back the Kickstarter, but I think it's kind of like an anime. I think it's another one of these like Miyazaki type things.
It kind of is. Yeah.
He says quests in Chubo's marvelous wish-granting engine. That's an underrated mechanic. They're a set of goals that your character gets by nudging scene framing and narration. Each goal is a dramatic beat and sort of like an Apocalypse World move. Every quest is like a personalized front with a built-in countdown clock. They are meant to encourage proactive play. So pretty cool. I think countdown clocks, when games do them correctly, countdown clocks are amazing. I don't think games should have 10 countdown clocks, but I do like it when they have a countdown clock. Sorry, John Harper. In general, I like them. I think they're great. So anyway, I guess I should do mine. No, let's do another community members before I do mine, because maybe I can find one that I can then transition to my own. I don't even remember what my own is.
Of.
So, oh, here we go. listener Ray, game designer Ray, says, the confessional in Inspectors. Oh boy, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
That one is really good.
Yeah, that one's really good. He says, that was a groundbreaking narrative mechanic it was, that consistently produces interesting play. Sure, it means diving a little into mockumentary style. I love that though. Or breaking the fourth wall a lot, but it's pretty amazing. For people who don't know what that is, Inspectors is a very, very, not freeform, but it's very loose narration style game, about like a Ghostbusters style group of paranormal investigators. The idea is your characters are actually like being recorded for a documentary or like a reality TV. It's a reality TV show about their ghost busting, company. And, this mechanic he's talking about, the confessional, is amazing. It's so fucking good. What it is every character, once per session, you get to do a confessional, like in a reality TV show, right? And in the confessional, whenever you do a confessional, you basically get full narrative control. So if there's something going on, like they're facing down the ghost or the monster and they're really sucking it up, or they don't have the thing they need, or it's just a disaster. Like you can like dive into a confessional and say, but luckily I managed to bring that book that has the spell that we needed to subdue the ghost, right? Yeah. Or you can use a confessional we've done some cool things with it. You can use a confessional to basically like say things about other characters that become binding on them. So you can say like, for whatever reason, such and such started speaking in a French accent, Right. And then so they like, now it's a binding thing and they have to do that. And then there's another thing you can do with them too. Remind me here. Anyway, it's stuff like that though. There are these certain types of actions you can do in the confessional that are like, that are binding and that let you kind of like control the story a bit, and, super good mechanic. And it really, really like nails home the idea of the reality TV show. So yeah, the confessional is pretty sweet. My underrated mechanic, the one that I wanted to talk about. So I love games that have setup processes that get you in the mood for the game, right?
Okay.
A lot of games have setup processes that are just like purely functional, like, okay, what is your character's name? Okay. Pick some traits. Okay. That's fine. It's not whatever. That's most games. But I love games that have a setup process that's actually a part of the game as well. Like it actually has there's like fun things you're doing. So, the Asshole Elf game. Right? Lost Days of Memories of Madness. Amazing setup process. Really, really fun. And you're actually playing a game kind of while you set the game up, right? But the one I want to talk about though is, One Last Job by Grant Howitt. That's probably an underrated game in general, but in particular, it's not even really a mechanic as much as it's just a procedure, but basically the way you set the game up. So let me backtrack. One Last Job is a game about, classic, like kind of caper movie type thing where you're getting the gang back together to go do one last job, right? And, in those movies, they always start with like a montage of like finding the guy who was the race car driver or whatever, or the getaway driver, finding the guy who's really good at demolitions, who's now working, dealing cards in Las Vegas or whatever.
Think Ocean's 11.
Yeah, it's very Ocean's 11, right? You're getting everybody together. You have that montage. That's how you set this game up. Like you have these, basically everyone, like you kind of in turn, like go, from player to player and assign, roles that way using that kind of thing. I don't remember exactly how it works mechanically.
The way it works is whoever's sort of like the GM player starts off as the boss who's going to get the gang back together, and they say, well, I need to find this guy, right? And we're going to need this guy. And so then he goes to recruit that guy. And you kind of set up who this guy is, like, oh, he's the best shot west of the Mississippi or whatever. And then someone volunteers to be that person. But they don't really get any say about who their character is, other than volunteering to play him.
This is how I got stuck being a character who every time they spoke had a different accent.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. So it's great because it's like, it's sort of collaborative character building, but with the addition of getting to screw over your friends and make them play really strange characters. So.
Yeah, it's awesome. It's so freaking fun. And I've actually noticed that my own nascent game design has some of this in it, like this this setup process that is meant to get you in the right headspace, you know?
Right.
Like my Three Forged game has that, right? Chuck E. Cheese has that, right? Like it's got this, maybe not as gamey as One Last Jobs, but definitely like there's a procedure by which I've identified like the 4 or 5 like key thematic elements, and there are things that you have to do, and by answering these questions and doing these steps, you're establishing like the foundation for making sure that the game feels like it's supposed to feel.
Right.
And so I just love that. And One Last Job does it great. Awesome. Let's switch, away from story games and, go to something more, tactical in nature. Listener, I don't know what this is. I don't know what I'm doing right now. I don't know. You know what? Community feedback style sessions are where I get to try things out. So just bear with me,
We're
listener.
getting real close to the point where I need to start playing the jazz music again.
Right. Something more.
I think it's Kristen's fault.
It might be Kristen. I think it's you. You do this to us.
I'm whimsical.
You do this to us. I get thinking about cute sushi and I can't control myself. All right. Listener.
It's good for you.
Listener Philip says, skill challenges from 4th edition. He says when mechanics are talked about, it's always the tactical combat in 4th edition. That's what 4th ed is known for, right? The board gamey style, combat. He says, which is pretty interesting if you like board gamey, stuff and you're into trad games. He said, but the skill challenge mechanic is asking you to try different skills at a task instead of just determining one, while also bringing in a teamwork aspect to the skill check. He says usually in skill-based systems, resolution can be pretty binary, and it's obvious which character will be the best one suited to it, to the task, because they have the highest applying skill. The skill challenge asks you, how are you approaching the tasks, and tells you which approach was successful and which didn't work as well. It gives you more narrative input than just pass-fail, right? He says, I like to see something like this. I like to see something like that in this very tactical combat-focused game. It was a nice way to make the non-combat stuff a little more interesting. You guys have played 4th Ed, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I have not. Is he right here? Is this a cool thing?
I feel like when I was reading the source book, I was like, this sounds pretty cool. And then I played 2 years of 4E and never did it once. We may have tried it once and then we're like, let's just punch things from now on.
let's just shoot magic missiles and shit, right?
Right.
Awesome.
For me, it's all about the implementation. So if you have a DM who's like, okay, we gotta get this done because it's in the module, just roll your dice and we'll like get past it, then it's not fun and it's grindy and it's boring and it sucks. But if you have somebody who sets it up as like, here's this problem, there are multiple ways you can go of addressing that, and it becomes this sort of problem-solving space in which, sure, you know, there's a wall to be overcome. Somebody with great dexterity can climb up the wall and get over it and fine. But not everybody can do that. And so what is everybody else going to do about that? It's fun to see people think creatively about doing things in a way that's different and works for their character. It's nice.
Yeah, a lot of what I've read is the skill challenge thing was like cool in theory, but it like people just didn't do it.
Yeah.
Or they,
Yeah,
you know,
I mean, I think it's so far removed from what the rest of the game is
Right,
that, yeah, like it was very easy to do poorly.
It's got to have a subtle hand. You can't be
Yeah,
like, skill check time, roll your dice.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. There are still people submitting to this thread, and I can't read them all. I'm glad the thread was very popular. It's awesome when people want to contribute. I would like to suggest that everyone should go find this thread on our G Plus community and check it out. Well, that's our podcast for this week. I hope you enjoyed it, listeners. I enjoyed recording it. Dan, how'd you feel about it?
I have mixed feelings about it.
Kristen?
A pleasure, as always.
Great. So if you would like to get in touch with us or join our community, you can do so by going to G+, that's Google+, and going to the community section of G+, that's Google+, and searching for The Gauntlet. We will pop right up and you can join us. We have another community because one was not enough. So it's
true.
It's like a Pringle.
Right.
It is Pringle.
Yes.
Once you pop, you can't just eat one.
That's
whatever.
exactly how it went.
It's not
Yeah.
quite, but yeah. Close
I
enough.
think that's right? We have two G Plus communities. The other one is Gauntlet Hangouts. Currently, we have just one regular event called Saturday Morning Cartoons, which I've mentioned. We have some folks getting other games ready to go, one-shot type scenarios. And then I am getting ready to launch a brand new weekly thing. It's called TGI Thursday. So we're going to have TGI Thursday and Saturday Morning Cartoons. And I want to do a thing for Sunday, but I can't think of a cool, like, TV programming phrase for Sunday. So listeners, if you have any ideas.
I guess it's a no-go then.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We should have changed days. We got to go to something else, clearly. Yeah, so listeners, if you can think of something cool like that, like a TV related thing to call Sunday, by all means, chime in. But no, we're gonna have TGI Thursday, some kind of Sunday thing eventually, and we still have Saturday morning cartoons. So go check that out. That's all I got. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Products of the Industrial Revolution. You're sheep of the Industrial Revolution.
Yep.
Instead of the primal wolf you're meant to be, or something.
Sheep are adorable.
Okay.